Now, the BBC is embroiled in an impartiality row after its journalists appeared to justify the killing of Israeli civilians by Hamas. The corporation said it was urgently investigating after social media activity by several of its journalists in the Middle East appeared to celebrate the attack, which left approximately 1,300 people dead. Reporters at BBC News Arabic endorsed comments likening Hamas, which is a designated terror group, to freedom fighters, as well as describing the October the 7th atrocity as a morning of hope. One senior correspondent appeared to make fun of the Israeli relatives of a grandmother who was abducted by Hamas, whilst another tweeted that Israel's prestige is crying in the corner. Meanwhile, the Beeb is under pressure to describe Hamas as a terror organisation, with the Conservative MP Michael Fabricant raising this issue in a letter to the broadcast regulator Ofcom. So is the BBC letting the country down with its approach to reporting on Israel? To debate this, let's go live to former BBC News producer John Mair and social worker and political commentator, a good friend of Mark Dolan tonight, a regular panellist, Yosef David. Yosef, let me ask you, why is it so important for the BBC to call Hamas terrorists?
Well, the BBC is known the world over, for some reason that I cannot understand, as an organisation which can be trusted to provide critical analysis and accurate information. And it's simply not accurate to refer to Hamas as anything else other than a terrorist organisation. We have to ask ourselves, what happened last week? What did Hamas do? Did they walk to the border fence with their hands held high saying, we can't take this anymore? Did they try to hold land? Did they go to try and see areas of interest for Palestinians? Or did they go and savagely kill people with the hope, probably, of destabilizing regional peace negotiations, but certainly with the aspiration of terrifying millions of Israelis and people across the world? That is the definition of terrorism. That is trying to achieve your political aims through violence. There is no other way to describe Hamas other than a terrorist organisation.
John Mair, the BBC say that they don't want to take sides. They talk about the importance of neutrality. But by not calling Hamas terrorists, perhaps they are taking a side.
They're not. They're absolutely spot on to do that. The BBC, if anything, is about impartiality, due impartiality, not taking sides. If next week, when Israel invades Gaza, and maybe they do acts that they shouldn't do, well, should the BBC call them terrorists? Because, you know, what is terrorism? What is state terrorism? Is Russia terrorist in Ukraine? You know, were the Israeli freedom fighters terrorists in 1948? What is a terrorist? You know, I when I was a producer, found myself in the 2010 election talking down talkback to Martin McGuinness, who was, you remember, the deputy chief of staff of the IRA.
With all due respect, murdering innocent people in their homes is terrorism.
Yosef, what was your point? Could you repeat that, please, Yosef?
With all due respect, murdering innocent people in their homes with the hope of affecting a political outcome is terrorism. Now, people have said it shouldn't be the government's position to tell a free broadcaster how to refer to either militants or terrorists. You shouldn't need a government intervention to tell you that what we saw was heinous terrorism. All you need are a set of eyes and a conscience.
Yes. John Mair, what is militant about beheading a baby? I would argue that by not calling Hamas terrorists, the BBC are gaslighting innocent Israeli victims.
Yeah.
Absolutely disgusting. Of course it's disgusting. But don't forget, Hamas are an elected government in Gaza. You know, they're not freelance terrorists. So what happens next week if Israel goes into Gaza and actually commits acts of what you might call terrorism? Should the BBC call them terrorists?
When was the last election in Gaza?
John, can I ask you about Al-Qaeda? Did the BBC describe them as terrorists? Did they describe Osama bin Laden as a terrorist?
I'm afraid they didn't. The BBC has, as you know, strict guidelines on this. They don't use the word terrorist in their reporting. They don't mind other people using the word terrorist, and they will use that. But BBC journalists are not allowed to use the word terrorist, and they're absolutely spot on this. And we won't get bullied by the government, by anybody else. The BBC should hold the line. It's an impartial broadcaster.
There you go, Yosef. It's impartiality, and the BBC are bound by journalistic convention and the rules.
I would say that the BBC are a collection of centrist ideologues who unfortunately can't see the wood for the trees anymore and don't represent the interests of the British people. It is in the interest of the British people to have accurate information. And if something is palpably a terrorist attack condemned by nations across the world, the BBC has a duty to present the facts as they are. And it's simple that
which they have. They have.
In a heinous way. I don't believe so. I'm sorry. The BBC, with respect,
John, let Yosef finish.
The BBC have known the modus operandi of Hamas since they came into power in the early 2000s. I read BBC articles highlighting that gay people had been murdered, that people had been tied to motorbikes and dragged through the roads, that Israelis had been murdered. So this is not something new. The BBC know what Hamas is, and the BBC must bear some responsibility for some degree of the community relations in this country by not presenting the facts as they are and presenting this moral relativism, which unfortunately it's simply nonsense.
Okay, the clock's against us. John, last word to you.
Who did the Palestinians demonstrate against yesterday? Who did they throw paint at? The Palestinian supporters in London. They threw paint at the BBC. So you're throwing verbal paint. The Palestinians are throwing red paint. The BBC has to be in the middle of all that. And as far as I can see, they're doing a bloody good job in reporting that war.
My thanks to former BBC News producer John Mair and social worker and political commentator Yosef David, who producer Maria tells me is joining us on the sofa on Friday. Looking forward to that.